It was 4:47 in the morning. He had no idea his entire life was about to change.
No mother in sight. Just a note, a car seat, and a name. Grace. He didn't know anything about babies. He didn't even own diapers. 6 weeks of exhaustion. And somewhere in it, something in him had already changed.
Dada.
Dada.
If you've ever believed that the family you were meant to have doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to, this story is going to stay with you long after it ends. This is a story about a man who never planned on being a father, a baby girl who arrived without warning, and a love neither of them saw coming. Stay until the very end, because what this man builds out of nothing is going to remind you what family really means. And if this story moves you even a little, tap that like button and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be shared. Now, let's begin. Owen Marsh was 32 years old, living alone in a small rented house at the end of Hollis Street, working long shifts as a night crew supervisor at a regional freight warehouse, when his entire life changed on an ordinary Tuesday in October, at 4:47 in the morning, to the sound of someone knocking urgently on his front door. He'd been asleep for exactly 2 hours, having just gotten home from a double shift, and his first groggy thought was that something had happened at the warehouse. He pulled on a t-shirt, stumbled to the door, and opened it to find no one there at all. Only a car seat sitting square in the middle of his welcome mat, a thin blue blanket tucked around a sleeping infant inside it, and a folded note taped to the handle. Owen stood frozen in his doorway for a long moment, certain he was still dreaming, before the baby stirred and let out a small, uncertain cry that snapped him fully awake. He crouched down, hands hovering uncertainly over the car seat, afraid to touch something so impossibly small and fragile, and reached instead for the note first, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. "Owen, I'm sorry. I can't do this. She's yours. Her name is Grace. I know this isn't fair to ask, but please don't let her end up in the system. I know you'll do right by her. Renee." Owen read the note 3 times before the words fully landed. Renee Castillo had been someone he dated briefly, nearly a year earlier, a relationship that had ended quietly and without drama when she'd taken a job 2 states away. He hadn't heard from her since, hadn't known she was pregnant, hadn't known until this exact freezing October morning standing barefoot on his own porch, that he had a daughter at all. He thought back, standing there with the note trembling in his hand, to the easy, uncomplicated months he and Renee had spent together the previous year. Weekend hikes, quiet dinners, a relationship that had never been especially serious but had never been unkind either. They'd parted amicably, both citing timing and geography rather than anything deeper, and Owen had genuinely wished her well when she left for her new job, never imagining that a single ordinary chapter of his life would resurface 11 months later in the form of a sleeping infant on his doorstep. He carried the car seat inside with the careful, terrified precision of someone handling live explosives, set it gently on his kitchen table, and sat down across from it, staring at the small sleeping face of a baby girl who was, according to a folded note and whatever paperwork might eventually confirm it, his responsibility now, entirely and immediately, whether he felt ready for it or not. He wasn't ready. Nobody would have been ready. He called his sister Dana at 5 in the morning, his voice shaking in a way she'd later say she'd never heard from him before, not even when their father died 3 years earlier. Dana arrived within 20 minutes, still in pajama pants, and found her brother sitting at his kitchen table, unmoving, staring at a sleeping infant like she might disappear if he looked away. "Owen," Dana said gently, kneeling beside the car seat. "Have you called anyone? A lawyer, social services, anything?" "I don't know what to do," Owen admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know anything about babies. I don't even own diapers." Dana, who had 2 kids of her own and a reservoir of practical calm Owen had always envied, made a list on the back of an envelope while Owen sat frozen, staring at the note in his hands. Diapers. formula, a crib, a pediatrician, a lawyer, to sort out the legal reality of what had just landed, without warning, in the middle of his ordinary life. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of sleep deprivation and steep, humbling learning curves. Owen learned, through trial and considerable error, how to properly warm a bottle, how to recognize the specific cry that meant hunger versus the one that meant a wet diaper versus the one that meant Grace simply wanted to be held, a distinction that took him nearly 3 exhausting weeks to reliably identify. He kept a small spiral notebook on the kitchen counter those first weeks, filling it with frantic, half-legible notes after every phone call to Dana or the pediatrician's after-hours line. Feeding amounts, nap lengths, the specific brand of formula that didn't upset Grace's stomach after the first 2 brands did. He taught himself to sleep in short, alert bursts. The way he imagined soldiers or new parents throughout history must have learned to, and developed an almost superstitious ritual of checking Grace's breathing every time he passed her bassinet, unable to fully trust, in those early weeks, that something so small and new could simply be fine on its own. He learned that warehouse night shifts were incompatible with newborn care, and made the terrifying decision to request a transfer to daytime logistics, accepting a pay cut he genuinely wasn't sure he could afford, because there was no version of fatherhood he was willing to attempt from the other side of an overnight shift. His lawyer, a patient, thorough woman named Carla Whitfield, spent the first month tracking down Renee, eventually locating her in another state and confirming, through a paternity test, Owen insisted on, despite his lawyer's assurance that it likely wasn't legally necessary, that Grace was unambiguously his biological daughter. Renee, when Carla finally reached her, was apologetic, exhausted-sounding, and firm in her decision. She'd been struggling with severe postpartum depression, living without family support in an unfamiliar city, and had made, in her own words, the only decision I could live with, for her sake and mine. She signed away her parental rights without contest, asking only, through Carla, that Owen someday tell Grace her mother hadn't abandoned her out of not loving her, but out of loving her enough to admit she couldn't give her what she needed. Owen didn't know, in those early weeks, whether to feel angry or heartbroken or simply overwhelmed by the sheer logistics of keeping a tiny human alive. Mostly he felt tired in a way he'd never experienced, a bone-deep exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel like wading through wet cement. But somewhere around week 6, folding impossibly small onesies at 2 a.m. while Grace slept in the bassinet beside his bed, he noticed something had shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was, however clumsily, building something. The early months tested him in ways he hadn't known to prepare for. There was the night Grace spiked a fever of 102 degrees and Owen sat in the emergency room until 4 a.m, terrified in a way that made his hands shake, certain every worst-case scenario running through his mind was somehow already happening. There was the humiliating incident at the grocery store when Grace, 4 months old, had a meltdown so complete and public that an older woman in line actually approached Owen to suggest, unhelpfully, that the mother should really handle situations like this better. And Owen had to explain, exhausted and raw, that there was no mother, just him, doing his absolute best. There was the crushing loneliness of 2 a.m. feedings, sitting alone in a dark nursery he'd built himself out of a converted home office, wondering if he was doing any of this right, wondering if Grace would someday resent the mother who left, or the father who never quite figured out how to braid hair or pick the right size of shoes. But there were other moments too, moments that quietly, steadily outweighed the exhaustion and doubt. The first time Grace smiled at him, an unmistakable, gummy, delighted grin at 4 weeks old that had nothing to do with gas, according to the pediatrician he'd anxiously asked. The first time she fell asleep on his chest during a Sunday afternoon nap, her tiny fist curled around his finger, and Owen sat motionless for nearly 2 hours rather than risk waking her. The first time she said, "Dada," at 11 months, babbled accidentally at first, then repeated deliberately, delightedly, over and over, as Owen felt something in his chest crack open in a way he didn't have adequate words for. Dana became a constant, steady presence throughout that first year, showing up with casseroles and unsolicited advice in equal measure, teaching Owen how to do a proper French braid using a doll as practice, staying over on nights when Owen was too exhausted to function safely alone. Owen's mother, initially skeptical that her son could handle single fatherhood at all, gradually transformed into Grace's most devoted grandmother, showing up unannounced with grocery bags and offering to babysit with an eagerness that surprised everyone, including herself. By the time Grace turned 2, Owen had built a rhythm that worked, imperfect but sturdy, organized entirely around her needs. He'd found a daycare he trusted, negotiated a work schedule that let him do daycare pickup by 5 most days, and learned, through steady practice, the 1,000 small competencies of single parenthood that had once terrified him entirely. He still made mistakes. He still occasionally put her shirt on backward or forgot picture day at daycare or burned dinner while trying to simultaneously answer a work email and referee a toddler meltdown. But he'd stopped being afraid of the mistakes. He'd learned, the way most parents eventually do, that showing up consistently mattered more than getting everything perfect. It was around Grace's 3rd birthday that Owen met Lila Wynn, a pediatric occupational therapist who'd been brought in to evaluate Grace after a daycare teacher raised gentle concerns about some developmental delays in her fine motor skills. Owen arrived at the first appointment braced for bad news, the particular anxious spiral of a parent who'd spent 3 years terrified of somehow failing his daughter in some way he hadn't anticipated. Lila, 29 years old, warm-eyed and unhurried in a way that immediately calmed Owen's spiraling nerves, spent the first 15 minutes simply playing with Grace on the clinic floor, watching her stack blocks and manipulate small toys with the careful, patient attention of someone who genuinely loved her work. "She's doing better than you probably think," Lila told Owen afterward, reviewing her notes. "Some of this is just normal variation. We'll do a few simple exercises, mostly through play, and I think you'll see steady improvement. You're clearly doing a lot right already." The reassurance hit Owen harder than he expected, 3 years of accumulated worry loosening slightly in his chest. Over the following months, as Grace attended weekly therapy sessions that increasingly looked, to Owen's relief, more like supervised playtime than clinical treatment, he found himself looking forward to the appointments for reasons that had less to do with Grace's progress and more to do with the easy, warm conversations he'd started having with Lila while Grace played nearby. Lila asked good questions, the kind that actually listened for the answer instead of waiting for her turn to talk. She remembered small details Owen mentioned in passing weeks earlier, asked genuinely about how he was managing, not just how Grace was progressing, and treated Owen's exhausted, imperfect single parenting with a kind of matter-of-fact respect he hadn't realized he'd been missing. She never once made him feel like Grace's story, the abandoned car seat, the absent mother, the terrifying first weeks, was something strange or tragic. She simply treated it as the beginning of a family that happened to come together differently than most, which, Owen realized slowly, was exactly how he'd started thinking about it himself. Their relationship developed slowly, deliberately, shaped carefully around Grace's routines and Owen's protective instinct to never introduce instability into his daughter's life without real confidence it would last. They dated for nearly 8 months before Lila met Grace outside of clinical sessions, a careful, intentional choice Owen insisted on, wanting to be certain of what he was building before letting his daughter's heart become part of the equation. When Lila finally did meet Grace in a non-clinical setting, at a Saturday morning trip to the park that Owen had anxiously overthought for nearly a week, Grace, 3.5 years old by then and utterly unfiltered in the way small children reliably are, took one look at Lila and asked, with complete seriousness, whether she was the block lady from Daddy's work who's actually really fun. Lila laughed, delighted. "That's me," she said. "Want to show me the slide?" Grace did, enthusiastically, for the next 45 minutes, dragging Lila by the hand toward every piece of playground equipment with the boundless energy only toddlers seem to possess. Owen watched from a nearby bench, something settling warmly in his chest as he observed the easy, natural affection between them. Unforced and immediate, in exactly the way he'd hoped for and hadn't quite dared to expect. Over the following year, Lila became a steady, welcome presence in both their lives, carefully, patiently, never rushing a process Owen remained protective of at every step. She was there for Grace's 4th birthday, helping blow up balloons and organize an admittedly chaotic backyard treasure hunt. She was there for Grace's first day of preschool, standing beside Owen at drop-off, both of them slightly more emotional than either wanted to admit. She was there 6 months later when Grace, drawing a family portrait for a preschool assignment, included Lila without hesitation, right beside Owen and herself, a small, unprompted act that Owen found himself unexpectedly tearing up over in his car afterward. It was Grace herself, in the end, who prompted the question Owen had been quietly considering for months. Sitting at the dinner table one evening, matter-of-fact in the way 4-year-olds often are about enormous questions, Grace asked whether Lila was going to be her actual mom or just her dad's special friend, a distinction she seemed to consider extremely important. Owen and Lila exchanged a glance across the table, something unspoken passing between them, both recognizing that the moment, however unexpectedly it had arrived, was real and needed an honest answer. "Would you like her to be your actual mom?" Owen asked carefully, watching his daughter's face. Grace considered this with the same serious deliberation she brought to choosing which stuffed animal to bring to daycare. "Yes," she said finally, decisively, "because she's really good at braiding, and you're bad at it, Daddy. No offense." Lila laughed so hard she nearly choked on her water, and Owen, laughing despite himself, found his eyes unexpectedly wet. They married the following spring, in a small backyard ceremony organized almost entirely around what would make Grace comfortable and included, right down to her insistence on being both flower girl and the boss of the flowers, a title she took with tremendous seriousness. Renee, invited at Owen's careful insistence and Carla's gentle facilitation, attended briefly, tearfully, watching from the back row as the daughter she'd once left on a doorstep in October ran down a flower-strewn aisle, laughing, secure, unmistakably loved. Afterward, Renee found Owen alone near the drink table and thanked him, her voice thick with emotion she'd clearly been holding back all afternoon. "I didn't know if I made the right choice," she admitted. "I think about it every day, but looking at her today, I think maybe I did." Owen, who had spent nearly 5 years building an answer to a question he'd never expected to have to answer, simply nodded. "You gave her a chance at exactly this," he said quietly. "I think that's about as right as a choice can be." That night, after the guests had gone home, and Grace had finally, reluctantly fallen asleep in her flower girl dress, Owen sat on his back porch with Lila, the same porch where he'd once spent countless exhausted 2 in the morning feedings wondering if he was doing any of it right. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Lila asked quietly. "The car seat on the porch?" Owen considered the question, watching the stars settle over a yard that had once felt impossibly overwhelming, and now simply felt like home. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about how terrified I was, how certain I was that I'd ruin everything, and then I think about how none of that terror mattered at all in the end compared to just showing up every single day. That's really all it ever took." Lila leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the same stars. "I think that's the whole secret," she said. "Nobody's ever actually ready. You just show up anyway, and the readiness kind of builds itself, one ordinary day at a time." And somewhere upstairs, sleeping soundly in a room decorated with the flower crown she'd insisted on wearing even to bed, was proof of exactly that. A little girl who had arrived on an October doorstep without warning, without a plan, without any guarantee at all, and had become, through nothing more extraordinary than one man's steady, imperfect, unwavering commitment to showing up, the single most important thing in an entire family's life. If this story reminded you that love doesn't always arrive the way we plan for, and that showing up consistently is worth more than being perfectly ready, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to believe that family can be built out of the most unexpected beginnings.